The morning of Lady Catherine Ashworth's wedding dawned grey and unwelcoming, autumn rain drumming against the leaded windows of her family's estate with a persistence that matched the hollow thudding of her heart. She sat before her vanity while her lady's maid arranged her dark hair into an elaborate coiffure, watching her own pale reflection with a curious detachment, as though observing a stranger being prepared for some solemn ritual she did not fully comprehend. The ivory silk of her wedding gown whispered against her skin, fine and costly, chosen by her mother with an eye toward impressing the groom's distinguished family rather than pleasing the bride herself. Outside, the ancient oaks shed their leaves in golden drifts, and Catherine thought how appropriate it was to marry in a season of dying things, for this union felt less like a beginning than an ending of something she could not quite name. She had met Duke Alexander Montrose exactly 4 times before this morning, formal encounters orchestrated by their families, conversations stilted and perfunctory, his dark eyes assessing her with the same cool efficiency he might employ when evaluating horseflesh or reviewing military dispatches. He was handsome in a severe way, she conceded, with sharp features carved by duty and hardened by years of military service, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command and utterly uninterested in the softer graces of courtship. Their betrothal had been arranged with admirable speed, the negotiations between families conducted with the brisk efficiency of a business transaction, which in essence it was her father's mounting debts resolved by the Montrose fortune, the Duke's family line secured by her youth and breeding. The ceremony itself unfolded in the chapel of Montrose Hall, with all the warmth of a military inspection, guests assembled in sombre rows, the words of the liturgy falling like stones into still water. Catherine spoke her vows in a voice she barely recognized as her own, feeling the weight of the ring Alexander slid onto her finger with hands that did not tremble, his touch brief and impersonal. When he lifted her veil to bestow the obligatory kiss, his lips barely grazed hers, a gesture toward tradition rather than affection, and his eyes held nothing but a distant politeness that made her feel more alone than she had ever felt in her 20 years. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow congratulations, and then came the moment that would define the shape of her new life. Alexander's quiet announcement that his regiment departed for Portugal at sunset, and that duty to crown and country could not be postponed even for a wedding night, that she should make herself comfortable at Montrose Hall in his absence. Catherine stood in the entrance hall as the afternoon waned, watching through rain-streaked windows as her husband of mere hours climbed into his waiting carriage without a backward glance, the vehicle disappearing down the tree-lined drive until even the sound of hoofbeats faded into the drumming rain, leaving her alone in this vast, unfamiliar house with servants she did not know and a title she had not yet learned to wear, a bride abandoned before she had truly become a wife. The first weeks of Catherine's residence at Montrose Hall unfolded with a dreamlike quality of unreality, as though she had stepped through some invisible threshold into a life that belonged to someone else entirely, a duchess playing at being mistress of a grand estate, while the true master remained absent, fighting wars in distant lands she could scarcely imagine. The house itself seemed to resist her presence with its vast corridors and countless rooms, each more imposing than the last, the ancestral portraits lining the walls regarding her with what she fancied was disapproval, as though these long-dead Montroses could sense her inadequacy for the role she had assumed. Mrs. Hallowell, the housekeeper, was a formidable woman of perhaps 50 years, her iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe knot, her dark eyes sharp with judgment, as she showed Catherine through the household accounts and linen inventories with barely concealed skepticism that this slip of a girl could manage a ducal estate, and Catherine felt the weight of that doubt settling upon her shoulders like a mantle she had not yet earned the right to wear. Mr. Pemberton the butler proved a gentler presence, his weathered face softening with kindness when he addressed her, and she found herself seeking his counsel more often than perhaps was proper, and grateful for his quiet competence and the way he anticipated her needs without making her feel inadequate for having them. In the evenings, when the servants had retired and the great house settled into silence, Catherine would wander through Alexander's private study, trailing her fingers along the spines of his books, military histories, and tactical treatises, but also worn volumes of poetry and philosophy that spoke of a mind more complex than his stern demeanor had suggested. His desk held maps of the Iberian Peninsula marked with incomprehensible notations, and she would stand studying them as though they might reveal something of the man she had married, this stranger whose name she bore but whose thoughts remained a mystery. Above the fireplace hung a portrait of a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, and Mrs. Hallowell had informed her with stiff formality that this was the late Duchess, Alexander's mother, who had died when he was but 14, and Catherine found herself staring into those painted eyes, wondering if this woman had also felt like a ghost haunting these halls, if she too had struggled to find her place within these unforgiving walls. Letters arrived from Portugal with irregular frequency, brief missives written in Alexander's precise hand that spoke of troop movements and weather conditions, but contained not a single word of personal sentiment, no inquiry into her well-being, no acknowledgement that he had left a bride behind, and Catherine would read them with a growing hollow feeling, understanding that she was a wife to a man who had no use for a wife, a duchess to a duke who required nothing from her but the eventual provision of an heir. Yet despite the coldness of her welcome and the strangeness of her situation, Catherine discovered within herself a quiet determination not to be merely an ornamental presence in this house, and she began asserting herself in small ways, meeting with the estate steward to review the tenant accounts, ordering improvements to the servants' quarters, establishing a routine of charitable visits to the village that gradually earned her the respect, if not the warmth, of the household staff. She was learning, slowly and painfully, to be a duchess to an empty title, a wife to a ghost, wondering all the while if Alexander would even recognize the life she was building in his absence, or if he would return if he returned at all, and sweep it all aside with the same cool efficiency with which he had spoken his wedding vows and ridden away into the rain. Lord Edmund Montrose arrived at Montrose Hall on a crisp November afternoon, 6 weeks after the wedding, his arrival announced by the cheerful clatter of hooves on the gravel drive and a vitality that seemed to brighten the grey stone of the estate merely by proximity, and Catherine, looking up from her correspondence in the morning room, felt her breath catch at the sight of him through the window, tall and fair-haired where his brother was dark, his face open and animated where Alexander's had been shuttered and severe, everything about him suggesting warmth and ease in a way that made the past weeks of solitude suddenly feel unbearably heavy. He swept into the house trailing laughter and London gossip, embracing a startled Mr. Pemberton with genuine affection, charming Mrs. Hallowell, until even her stern countenance softened into something approaching a smile, and when he finally stood before Catherine in the drawing-room, bowing over her hand with eyes that actually saw her rather than looking through her to some distant battlefield, she felt something shift in her chest that was equal parts relief and danger. Edmund explained that he had come to ensure his new sister-in-law was settling in comfortably. That family duty demanded he check on her welfare in Alexander's absence, but his presence suggested motivations more generous than mere obligation. He asked her opinions on matters ranging from estate management to the latest novels, listened with genuine interest to her halting descriptions of her adjustment to Montrose Hall, treated her not as a decorative necessity, but as a person of intelligence and worth whose thoughts merited attention. In the days that followed, he transformed the oppressive silence of the house with his presence, suggesting small improvements to the drafty windows, organizing an impromptu dinner party that brought neighbors Catherine had not yet met, encouraging her to redecorate the dreary morning room in colors that pleased her, rather than honoring the choices of duchesses long dead, and she found herself laughing for the first time since her wedding day, found herself looking forward to mornings because Edmund might call, found herself taking more care with her appearance in case he should visit. He brought her books from London, volumes of poetry and modern novels that Alexander would never have thought to provide, and they would sit by the fire reading passages aloud to one another while the November winds howled outside, his voice bringing the words to vivid life in a way that made her forget the vast emptiness of the rest of the house. Catherine told herself that this was merely the kindness of family, that Edmund's attentiveness was nothing more than brotherly concern for his sibling's abandoned bride, but she could not deny the way her heart lifted at the sound of his voice in the hall, the way her days felt longer and grayer when he was absent, the dangerous warmth that bloomed in her chest when he smiled at her across the dinner table, as though she were the most fascinating woman he had ever encountered. She tried to summon guilt for the pleasure she took in his company, reminding herself that she was a married woman, that Alexander was her husband regardless of his absence, But the letters from Portugal continued to arrive with their cold recitations of military movements and weather patterns, containing not a single word of personal warmth or inquiry into her well-being, and she could not help the bitter thought that formed in the quiet hours of night that Edmund treated her with more consideration in a single afternoon than Alexander had shown in their entire acquaintance. And if this made her heart a traitor to her marriage vows, then perhaps those vows had been hollow from the moment they were spoken. The weeks passed with the slow inevitability of winter's approach, December bringing frost to the windows and ice to the fountains, and with each passing day, Edmund's visits grew more frequent, while Alexander's letters arrived less often, the intervals between them stretching from weeks to months, until Catherine sometimes wondered if her husband had forgotten her existence entirely, or perhaps never truly registered it to begin with. She and Edmund fell into a rhythm that felt dangerously natural, afternoons spent walking through gardens where their breath misted in the cold air, and their conversations ranged from the profound to the trivial with equal ease, evenings by the fire, reading aloud from books they both loved, discovering a shared passion for Byron's poetry and Walter Scott's romances, and Catherine found herself memorizing the cadence of Edmund's voice, the way his eyes lit with enthusiasm when discussing literature or music, the warmth of his laugh that seemed to thaw something frozen within her chest. The household staff noticed, of course servants always noticed such things, and Mrs. Hallowell's disapproval manifested in tight-lipped silences and pointed remarks about propriety, her dark eyes following Catherine with judgment whenever Edmund was present, as though the housekeeper could see the dangerous current running beneath the surface of their friendship and disapproved of waters she could not control. Catherine told herself repeatedly that there was nothing improper in their interactions, that Edmund was family and his attention merely brotherly concern, but she could not deny the quickening of her pulse when she heard his voice in the hall, the way she found herself choosing her gowns with more care on days he might visit, the dangerous warmth that bloomed in her chest when he smiled at her across the piano as they played duets together, their hands moving in harmony across the keys. It was during one such evening in late December, snow falling softly beyond the windows and the fire crackling warmly in the grate, that Catherine became acutely aware of how close Edmund sat beside her on the piano bench, their shoulders nearly touching as they worked through a complicated Mozart piece. And when her fingers stumbled over a difficult passage, his hand moved to guide hers, his touch sending such a shock through her system that she pulled away as though burned, rising abruptly from the bench with some stammered excuse about the late hour. Edmund had looked at her with eyes that held too much understanding, too much reciprocal feeling, and the silence that stretched between them thrummed with all the things neither could say, all the impossible desires that propriety and honor forbade, and Catherine felt the full weight of her position crushing down upon her legally bound to a man who had abandoned her, emotionally drawn to one who could never be hers, trapped in a marriage that existed only on paper, while her heart yearned for substance and warmth that her husband had never offered and likely never would. That night she lay awake, listening to the winter wind howl around the eaves of Montrose Hall, thinking of Alexander somewhere in Portugal, fighting battles she could not imagine, and wondering if he ever thought of her at all, if the cold formality of his letters reflected genuine indifference, or merely the habits of a man who had spent too long at war to remember how to be tender, and she realized with painful clarity that she was caught between two impossible situations, a husband who was a stranger and a man who could never be more than a friend, her heart divided between duty to vows spoken without love and the aching loneliness of a marriage, unconsummated and abandoned, while winter deepened outside and the walls of the great house seemed to press ever closer, witnesses to her growing desperation and the dangerous path her thoughts were beginning to travel. January arrived with bitter cold and news that shattered the fragile equilibrium Catherine had constructed within the walls of Montrose Hall, word reaching England through military dispatches that Wellington's forces had engaged in a devastating battle near the Spanish border, and Alexander's regiment had been at the heart of the conflict, the casualty lists incomplete and confused in those first terrible days when Catherine could do nothing but wait and imagine horrors she had no context to properly envision. The letter came from Alexander's commanding officer rather than Alexander himself, brief and impersonal in its recitation of facts: major engagement, heavy losses, the Duke of Montrose among the wounded, and his condition, and whereabouts uncertain in the chaos following the battle, and Catherine found herself staring at the words until they blurred into meaningless marks upon the page, her hands trembling with an emotion she could not immediately name, because she had never truly known her husband well enough to understand what his loss might mean. Edmund arrived within hours of receiving his own notification, his face drawn and pale, the usual lightness gone from his manner as he stood in the drawing room where Catherine sat, frozen with the letter still clutched in her fingers, and she watched him read the same terrible words she had memorized, saw the grief that crossed his features, and recognized it as something far deeper than her own confused response, because Edmund had actually known Alexander, had grown up alongside him, possessed years of memories and affection that Catherine could never claim. They spent the following weeks in a strange, suspended state, neither quite mourning nor hoping, checking every post for additional news, while the winter deepened outside and the uncertainty stretched Catherine's nerves to breaking, and she discovered with painful clarity that she did not wish Alexander dead, despite their hollow marriage, that the thought of him lying wounded and alone on some foreign battlefield filled her with a distress that was genuine, even if it was not the grief of a devoted wife. Edmund stayed at Montrose Hall throughout those agonizing weeks, propriety be damned in the face of potential family tragedy, and Catherine leaned on him with an intimacy born of shared fear and their conversations in the firelit evenings, ranging from memories he shared of Alexander as a boy to whispered confessions about the guilt they both carried. Catherine for her growing feelings toward Edmund despite her marriage vows, Edmund for the terrible thought that had crossed his mind in the first moment of hearing the news, the shameful flash of hope that Alexander's death might free them both. When the second letter finally arrived in late February, Catherine's hands shook so violently that Edmund had to break the seal, and they read together the terse update from a military surgeon. The Duke had been located in a field hospital, gravely wounded but expected to survive, currently recovering under medical supervision before being sent to convalesce in Lisbon, and Catherine felt her knees buckle with relief so profound it frightened her, the realization crashing over her that she had been genuinely terrified of becoming a widow to a man she barely knew, and that some part of her had been hoping against hope that Alexander would return, if only to give them a chance to discover whether their marriage might have contained some possibility she had been too lonely and hurt to see. Edmund caught her as she swayed, his arms strong and steady around her, and they stood there in the morning light, holding one another with a desperation that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the shared terror they had endured. And when Catherine finally pulled back to look at his face, she saw her own conflict mirrored there. Relief at Alexander's survival, tangled with the complicated recognition that his return to health meant the continuation of all barriers that stood between them, the impossible situation rendered even more impossible by the knowledge that they had both, in their darkest moments, hoped for a freedom that would have come only through Alexander's death, and now they would have to live with the shame of that hope even as they rejoiced in his survival. Spring arrived at Montrose Hall with an almost cruel beauty, the grounds bursting into bloom just as another letter arrived from the War Office, this one bearing the official seal and the terrible formality that accompanied notifications of the gravest kind. And Catherine stood in the morning room with trembling hands as Mr. Pemberton presented the correspondence on a silver tray, his old face creased with concern because he too understood what such letters meant, and when she broke the seal and read the words "regret to inform," "killed in action, ambush outside Toulouse," "body not recovered," the paper slipped from her fingers and drifted to the floor like a fallen leaf, and she felt the world tilt sideways in a way it had not even during the previous scare, because this time there was no uncertainty, no hope of reprieve, only the stark finality of those terrible words that declared Alexander Montrose dead and made Catherine a widow before she had ever truly been a wife. Edmund arrived within the day, his own notification having reached him in London, and Catherine saw in his face a grief so profound and genuine that it shamed her own confused response, because while she felt sorrow and shock and a strange hollow emptiness, Edmund was losing a brother he had known and loved despite their differences, and she watched him weep with an abandon that moved her deeply, his usual charm and lightness stripped away to reveal the depth of feeling beneath. The household draped itself in mourning, black crepe appearing on mirrors and windows, the staff moving through their duties with hushed voices and somber faces. Mrs. Hallowell's disapproval temporarily suspended in the face of genuine tragedy, and Catherine found herself going through the motions of grief, accepting condolence calls, ordering mourning clothes, writing letters to distant relatives, while feeling oddly disconnected from the reality of Alexander's death, as though she were mourning not a husband, but an idea, a possibility that had been snatched away before it could ever materialize into something real. The weeks passed in a haze of black bombazine and sympathetic visitors, spring deepening into early summer outside, while Catherine remained sequestered in the dim halls of Montrose Hall, and Edmund stayed close throughout, his presence a comfort, even as his own grief gradually transformed into something else, a careful attention that Catherine recognized because she felt its echo in her own heart, the slow, guilty realization that Alexander's death had removed the one insurmountable barrier between them, that they were now free to acknowledge feelings they had been fighting for months, and the knowledge brought with it a shame so heavy Catherine could barely breathe beneath its weight, because what kind of woman felt relief at her husband's death? What kind of widow allowed herself to think of love when she should be consumed by grief? Yet as the summer months unfolded, and society's expectations of her mourning period became clear a year at minimum before she could even consider remarriage, as longer before it would be truly proper, Catherine found herself in an impossible position, legally free but socially bound, her heart pulling toward Edmund, even as propriety demanded she remain in widow's weeds and solitary contemplation, and Edmund, dear Edmund, seemed to understand her conflict without words, maintaining a careful distance, even as his eyes followed her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken and her hands tremble when he was near, and they danced around the truth between them, like moths circling a flame, both knowing they were moving toward something dangerous and inevitable, both unable or unwilling to stop the slow gravitational pull drawing them together now that death had severed the legal ties that had kept them apart, though Catherine could not shake the terrible guilt that whispered in the dark hours of night that she was betraying Alexander's memory, by allowing herself to feel anything but grief, by permitting her heart to turn toward his brother, when his body was not even cold in whatever unmarked grave held it in foreign soil. Summer arrived at Montrose Hall with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the harsh trials of spring, and the gardens bursting into riotous bloom, as though nature itself sought to compensate for the cruelty of war and loss, and Catherine found herself walking among the roses one warm June afternoon, 3 months into her widowhood, when Edmund appeared on the gravel path, with an expression so tender and conflicted that her breath caught in her throat because she knew without words what he had come to say, what they had both been circling around for weeks now, with the careful dance of two people who understood the enormity of crossing certain lines. He stopped a few paces from her, the summer sun casting shadows across his face, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper, rough with emotion as he said, "Catherine, I cannot continue this pretense any longer. This careful distance we maintain when everyone has departed, and when we are alone in these halls, and I can think of nothing but how much I have come to." And she raised her hand to stop him, tears already gathering in her eyes, because she knew she should not permit him to continue, and should not allow the words to be spoken that could never be taken back. Yet she found herself unable to move, unable to do anything but stand there among the roses as he closed the distance between them and took her trembling fingers in his own warm hands. The confession spilled from him then, all the feelings he had been containing for months, how he had fallen in love with her, almost from the first, how her loneliness had called to something deep within his own soul, how he had fought against his feelings out of loyalty to Alexander. But now that Alexander was gone, he could not bear to watch her grieve alone, when his own heart was breaking with the need to comfort her, to give her the love and devotion she deserved, and Catherine felt herself fracturing under the weight of his words, the truth she had been denying even to herself, rising up to meet his declaration because, yes, she loved him too. He had loved him, perhaps, since those first dark months, when he had been the only light in her isolated existence, and the guilt of that love was nearly crushing but not quite enough to stop her from whispering through her tears, "Edmund, I should not, we cannot, but I," and he understood what she could not quite say, pulling her gently into his arms there in the rose garden where any servant might see, the propriety abandoned in favor of the desperate human need they both felt. Their first kiss was hesitant and sweet, laden with all the guilt and longing they had been suppressing, his lips gentle against hers as though she might shatter, her hands clutching his coat as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. And when they finally drew apart, they stood with foreheads touching, breathing hard, both knowing they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, yet neither willing to regret it entirely. And Edmund whispered that they must wait, must observe a proper mourning period before making anything official, but that he would wait as long as necessary if she would only promise him hope, promise him a future when the time was right. Catherine agreed through her tears, understanding that what they were beginning was secret and dangerous and weighted with the ghost of Alexander's memory, yet unable to deny herself this one source of warmth in the cold landscape of her grief. And as the summer weeks passed, they conducted a careful courtship disguised as family support, and stolen moments in the library when the household slept, whispered conversations in the garden at twilight, Edmund's hand finding hers beneath the table during dinner, and slowly, so slowly, Catherine began to feel the weight of Alexander's memory lighten, began to imagine a future that held not just duty and grief, but genuine happiness, began to allow herself to live again in ways she had never truly lived before. And Montrose Hall itself seemed to transform with their carefully hidden joy, as though the very stones of the building had been waiting for love to finally fill its halls. October arrived at Montrose Hall with a crispness that promised transformation, the leaves turning gold and crimson as though nature itself celebrated the change that was about to unfold. And on a morning when mist hung low over the gardens, Edmund came to Catherine in the library where she sat reading, his face more serious than she had seen in weeks. And before she could speak, he knelt before her chair in the traditional posture, drawing from his pocket a ring that had belonged to his mother, a delicate sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the morning light, and his voice trembled slightly as he said, "Catherine, we have observed the proper mourning period. We have been patient and careful, but I can wait no longer. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" She felt tears spring to her eyes as she whispered yes, her hand shaking as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he rose to kiss her, it was with a joy so pure and unrestrained that all the months of guilt and secrecy seemed to burn away in its warmth, leaving only the promise of a future they could finally claim openly. The announcement was made to society within the week, carefully worded notices sent to the appropriate newspapers, letters dispatched to family and friends, and while there were those who whispered behind gloved hands about the unseemly haste of a widow marrying her late husband's brother, most agreed that 6 months was technically sufficient mourning for a marriage that had lasted mere hours before the husband's departure, and Edmund's position and Catherine's impeccable behavior during her widowhood smoothed most objections, and soon Montrose Hall buzzed with the pleasant chaos of wedding preparations. Catherine found herself in the modiste's shop in the nearby town, standing before mirrors as bolt after bolt of fabric was draped around her, and the contrast to her first wedding preparations could not have been more stark. Then she had chosen quickly and without care, knowing the gown would be seen by no one who mattered, worn for a ceremony that was mere formality. But now she examined each detail with the attention of a woman who was truly becoming a bride, selecting a gown of ivory silk with delicate Brussels lace at the throat and sleeves, a creation that would take weeks to complete, but would be perfect for the November ceremony they had planned. Edmund was everywhere in those weeks, his enthusiasm infectious as he spoke of the life they would build together. They would travel to Italy for their honeymoon, he said, spend the spring in Venice and Florence seeing all the art and architecture she had only read about in books, and when they returned to Montrose Hall, they would fill its rooms with laughter and music, and eventually children, many children, he hoped, and he would be a better husband than Alexander had ever been, because he understood the precious gift he was being given in Catherine's hand and heart. The household responded to the engagement with mostly genuine pleasure, Mr. Pemberton's old face creasing into smiles as he oversaw preparations, the younger maids giggling as they cleaned and polished every surface until the manor gleamed, though Mrs. Hallowell maintained a certain reserve, her lips pressed thin whenever she observed the couple together, as though she alone remembered that Catherine had been Duchess of Montrose before she became Edmund's intended, but even her disapproval could not dim the joy that seemed to permeate every stone of the estate. The wedding date was set for the third Saturday in November, enough time to prepare properly, but not so distant as to seem hesitant, and as the leaves fell from the trees and the first frosts touched the gardens, Catherine felt herself transforming from the abandoned bride she had been into something entirely new, a woman who had chosen her own happiness, who had survived loneliness and loss, and emerged ready to embrace life with open hands. And when she looked at Edmund across the dinner table or walked with him through the autumn gardens, she felt certain that this time, this wedding, would be the beginning of something real and lasting and true, that the future finally held not merely duty but genuine promise, and she allowed herself to believe that happiness was not just possible but inevitable, that she had earned it through the long months of waiting and grief, and that nothing could now stand between her and the life she had dreamed of during those dark, solitary nights when Alexander's ghost had haunted these halls and Edmund's love had seemed impossibly distant. November came to Montrose Hall with a bitter chill that seemed to presage something darker than mere winter, and Catherine stood in her chamber 2 weeks before the wedding, examining the ivory silk gown that hung against the wardrobe, her heart light with anticipation despite the grey skies outside, when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel drew her to the window, and what she saw there froze the blood in her veins, because the carriage that had pulled up to the entrance was not one she recognized, and the man who stepped down from it moved with a stiff, painful gait that spoke of old injuries, and even from this distance, even though it was impossible, even though he was dead, she knew with a terrible certainty that it was Alexander. The world seemed to tilt sideways as she watched him stand before the entrance of his own home, gaunt and scarred and very much alive, his dark hair longer than it had been, his face harder and leaner, bearing the unmistakable marks of suffering, and she found herself gripping the window frame as though it were the only solid thing in a reality that had suddenly become unmoored, her mind racing through impossible explanations, even as her heart began a slow, sickening descent, because she understood in that moment that everything she had built with Edmund, all the happiness she had allowed herself to claim, was about to shatter like glass. She made her way down the stairs on trembling legs, arriving in the entrance hall just as Mr. Pemberton opened the door, the old butler's face going white with shock as he beheld his master return from the grave, and Alexander stepped into the house with the bearing of a man who had walked through hell itself, his eyes sweeping the familiar surroundings with an expression that was equal parts relief and something darker, and when those eyes found Catherine standing frozen on the stairs, she saw the flash of recognition, followed immediately by confusion because she was wearing a gown he had never seen, her hair styled in a manner she had not worn when he left, everything about her speaking of a life lived in his absence. The confrontation that followed was a scene from Nightmare, Edmund appearing from the library at the sound of voices, his face transforming from curiosity to absolute horror as he beheld his brother, and the three of them stood in a terrible triangle in the drawing-room, where Catherine had to explain through numb lips that yes, Alexander had been reported dead, that yes, she and Edmund had believed it, that yes, they were engaged to be married in a fortnight, each word falling like stones into the awful silence, and Alexander's face cycled through disbelief to comprehension, to a cold fury that was somehow worse than any explosion of temper could have been. Alexander's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough from disuse, and something deeper, asking, how long, demanding to know when his wife and his brother had decided to betray him, and Edmund's attempt to explain that Alexander had been gone, that Catherine had been alone, that they had believed him. Dead sounded hollow, even to Catherine's own ears, because underneath the justifications lay the terrible truth that they had fallen in love while Alexander still breathed, that his reported death had merely freed them to act on feelings that had already taken root. The revelation that Alexander had been captured by French forces, held in a prison camp where conditions were so brutal that the British command had simply assumed all prisoners dead, that he had survived through sheer stubborn will, only to be freed in a recent prisoner exchange and spend weeks making his way back to England, back to a home and a wife he had dreamed of during the darkest hours of his captivity, only to find that wife planning to marry his own brother. This revelation hung in the air like an accusation that needed no voice, and Catherine felt the weight of her guilt crushing her, even as part of her wanted to scream that he had abandoned her first, that he had left her alone in this vast house, mere hours after their wedding, that she had every right to seek comfort where she could find it. Edmund's anguish was written across every line of his face as he looked between his brother and the woman he loved. And when he spoke, it was to say that he would leave immediately, that he understood the engagement must be dissolved, that he had never meant to cause pain. And though Catherine wanted to protest, wanted to cling to the happiness that had seemed so close, she found herself unable to speak because she knew he was right, knew that the law and society and every code they lived by declared her still Alexander's wife, bound to a man who was a stranger, but whose legal claim superseded any claim of the heart. The sapphire ring came off her finger with a finality that felt like death, placed carefully on the table between them, and as Edmund bowed stiffly to them both and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the hall, Catherine and Alexander stood in silence, two people bound by vows and law and nothing else, the ghost of Edmund's presence hanging between them, and Alexander's words when he finally spoke were quiet and devastating as he said, "I see I should have stayed dead," and Catherine had no answer to give him because in that moment she almost wished he had. Edmund departed Montrose Hall before dawn the following morning, unable to bear even one night under the same roof as the brother whose return had cost him everything, and Catherine watched from her chamber window as his carriage disappeared into the grey November mist, feeling as though her heart was being torn from her chest with each turn of the wheels. And when she finally descended to breakfast, she found Alexander already seated at the long dining table, his gaunt frame seeming almost spectral in the morning light, and they ate in a silence so complete that the clink of silver against china sounded like accusations, neither able to meet the other's eyes because to look was to confront the impossible situation they now inhabited, legally bound as husband and wife, yet strangers who had been shaped by entirely different experiences of the same marriage, his defined by war and captivity and dreams of home, hers by abandonment and loneliness, and a love that law and society now deemed forbidden. The days that followed established a pattern of careful avoidance, Catherine managing the household as she had for over a year, while Alexander moved through the manor like a ghost haunting his own life, and though they shared the same roof, they might as well have inhabited different worlds for all the connection between them, speaking only when necessity demanded, and even then in the most formal of tones, each word measured and cold as the frost that coated the windows each morning. Alexander's pride was a visible wound, manifesting in the rigid set of his shoulders and the bitter line of his mouth, and Catherine understood that while he acknowledged intellectually that he had abandoned her and had failed in his duty as a husband from the very first day, his heart still felt the sting of betrayal because she had been his in law, if not in love, and to discover her planning marriage to his own brother was a humiliation that cut deeper than any wound he had suffered in battle or captivity. Catherine's own grief was equally complex, mourning not just the loss of Edmund and the future they had planned, but also the person she had been during those months with him, the woman who laughed freely, who allowed herself joy, who believed happiness was her right rather than a privilege to be earned through suffering. And in Alexander's presence, she felt herself hardening back into the dutiful shell she had worn on their wedding day, all warmth and spontaneity, freezing under the weight of his silent judgment. The household moved around them with the careful steps of people navigating a battlefield. Mr. Pemberton's face perpetually creased with worry, Mrs. Hallowell's lips pressed even thinner than usual as though vindicated in her earlier disapproval, the younger servants whispering in corners about the strange marriage of their master and mistress who barely spoke and never touched. And Catherine wanted to scream at them all that she had not asked for this, that she had been a good and faithful wife until every reason for faithfulness had been stripped away. But she maintained her composure because that was what duchesses did. They endured with grace even when their hearts were breaking. Yet as November deepened toward December, Catherine began to notice things about Alexander that penetrated even her grief and anger, the way he winced when the weather turned cold, favoring his left side where she suspected old injuries lingered, the nightmares that sometimes woke him in the hours before dawn when she heard his cries through the walls that separated their chambers, the haunted look in his eyes when he thought himself unobserved, as though he had brought the ghosts of war home with him and could not quite believe he was truly safe. And despite everything, despite her love for Edmund and her resentment of Alexander's return, she felt an unwanted stirring of compassion for this scarred stranger who was her husband. Alexander, too, was beginning to see Catherine with new eyes, observing the quiet competence with which she managed the estate, the kindness she showed to servants, the careful accounting books that revealed her stewardship, had not merely maintained Montrose Hall but improved it, and he began to understand what Edmund had seen in her, began to recognize that in abandoning her, he had not just failed in duty, but had missed knowing a woman of genuine worth and strength, though this recognition brought no comfort, only a deeper shame that twisted in his gut alongside the anger, because he had created the very situation that had driven her into his brother's arms, and he could blame no one but himself, even as he resented them both for finding in each other what he had been too damaged and duty-bound to offer. November's chill settled into Alexander's bones, with a viciousness that spoke of old injuries poorly healed, and on the third morning, after Edmund's departure, Catherine found him in the library attempting to reach a volume from an upper shelf, his face grey with pain, as his left arm refused to cooperate, and though every instinct told her to maintain the distance they had established, she found herself crossing the room and retrieving the book for him, their fingers brushing briefly as she handed it over, and his quiet, "Thank you," was the first civil word they had exchanged since that terrible confrontation in the drawing room. The weather worsened as the month progressed, bringing early snow and bitter winds that howled around Montrose Hall like the ghosts of all their mistakes, and Alexander's limp became more pronounced, his movements careful and pained in ways that spoke of suffering he was too proud to acknowledge, until one evening Catherine noticed him attempting to manage the stairs to his chamber and saw him pause halfway up, gripping the banister with white knuckles, and she understood that whatever wounds he had sustained in captivity still plagued him in ways he would never admit. She began leaving a draft for Payne on the table outside his door each night, never mentioning it, never waiting to see if he took it, simply ensuring it was there, and though he never thanked her, she noticed the glass was always empty by morning, and this small, silent exchange became a thread connecting them across the chasm of hurt and resentment. Their conversations remained stilted and brief, conducted with the formal politeness of strangers forced to share accommodation, but gradually Catherine began to notice details about Alexander that penetrated her grief and anger, the way he paused before her mother's portrait in the hall, with an expression of such profound sadness that she understood his loss had been as great as her own, the careful way he handled the estate ledgers she had maintained, as though acknowledging her competence, even if he could not speak it, and the books of poetry she found, marked in his study, suggesting a soul far more tender than the cold soldier who had left her on their wedding day. One night in late November she was awakened by sounds from his chamber, terrible cries that spoke of anguish beyond anything physical, and though she knew she should ignore it, should maintain the boundaries they had established, she found herself in her dressing gown, moving through the connecting door she had never before opened, finding him tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, caught in the grip of a nightmare so vivid that he was fighting invisible enemies, and she acted on pure instinct, touching his shoulder and speaking his name until his eyes opened, wild and unseeing, before recognition slowly returned. The vulnerability in his face in that moment was so complete, so devastating, that Catherine felt something crack in the ice around her heart, and when he whispered a broken apology, she found herself sitting on the edge of his bed, saying that there was nothing to apologize for, that she understood nightmares were not chosen, and for a handful of heartbeats they simply looked at each other, really looked, perhaps for the first time since his return, and what she saw in his eyes was not the cold duke or the abandoning husband, but a man who had survived horrors she could not imagine and was still trying to find his way back to himself. He did not speak of what he had dreamed, and she did not ask, but when she rose to leave he caught her hand briefly, his grip gentle despite the tremor in his fingers, and said, "Thank you." Catherine, using her given name for the first time since his return, and the sound of it in his rough voice sent an unexpected warmth through her, even as she reminded herself that compassion was not forgiveness, that tending his nightmares did not erase the fact that she loved another man, that they were still strangers bound by law and nothing more. Yet in the days that followed she found herself watching him more carefully, observing the way he moved through the house, as though relearning how to exist in peacetime, the haunted look that never quite left his eyes, the careful control he maintained over every word and gesture, as though afraid of what might emerge if he let his guard down. And she began to recognize in him the same protective shell she herself had worn, the same fear of vulnerability that came from being hurt too deeply, and this recognition stirred something in her that felt dangerously like understanding. December arrived with a fury of snow and wind that seemed determined to seal Montrose Hall away from the rest of the world. And on the morning of the 15th, exactly 1 year since their wedding, Catherine woke to find the windows completely obscured by white, the drifts so high that even the stables were barely visible, and though neither she nor Alexander mentioned the significance of the date when they met at breakfast, she saw in his eyes that he remembered, just as she did, the cold ceremony and his departure into rain, while she had stood alone in her bridal gown, feeling like a widow before she had ever truly been a wife. The snow continued throughout the day, trapping them together more completely than they had been since his return, and by evening, when the servants had retired early due to the cold, Catherine and Alexander found themselves the only souls awake in the vast manor, drawn almost against their will to the warmth of the library fire, where they sat in chairs positioned at a careful distance, the silence between them heavy with all the words they had not spoken. It was Alexander who broke first, his voice rough as though he had forgotten how to speak of anything beyond the practical necessities of their daily existence, and he said, "I was thinking of Badajoz today, the siege, and I realized it was snowing then too, though nothing like this. And I remember believing I would die there, and my only regret was that I had never really lived, never allowed myself to want anything beyond duty and honor." Catherine looked at him across the firelight, seeing the shadows that played across his scarred face, and something in his raw honesty compelled her own, so she found herself speaking of the months after he had left, the terrible loneliness of this house, the way she had felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life, and for the first time she spoke Edmund's name aloud between them, acknowledging that his brother had given her something to live for when she had been drowning in the emptiness Alexander's departure had created. The confession hung in the air like the snow outside, dangerous and transformative, and Alexander's hands tightened on the arms of his chair before he said quietly, "I failed you from the beginning, Catherine. I knew it even as I left that day. I told myself it was duty, that the war required me, but the truth was I was a coward, afraid of what it would mean to let someone matter to me when I believed I would likely die in Spain." She heard the admission for what it was, not an excuse but a recognition of his own culpability, and she nodded slowly, saying, "You did fail me, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I failed you too. Or at least I failed the vows we made, even if those vows felt hollow at the time, and perhaps we have both been paying the price for decisions made in fear rather than courage." They talked through the night as the storm raged outside, speaking of things they had never shared with anyone. Alexander's terror during his months of captivity, his belief that he would never see England again, and his dreams of home that had sustained him through horrors she could barely comprehend, and Catherine's own journey from dutiful daughter to abandoned wife, to woman who had dared to reach for happiness only to have it snatched away, and in the telling they began to see each other not as the people they had imagined, but as the flawed, frightened, hopeful souls they actually were. As dawn broke grey and cold, revealing a world transformed by snow into something strange and beautiful, they sat in exhausted silence, and Alexander finally said, "We cannot recapture what we never had, Catherine, but perhaps we might build something new from these ruins, if you are willing." And she looked at him with eyes that burned from tears and weariness, and saw not the Duke who had abandoned her or the obstacle to her happiness, but simply a man asking for a chance, and she heard herself saying, "I am willing to try, though I do not know if my heart can heal from Edmund. I do not know if I can ever feel for you what I felt for him." And Alexander's response was gentle, almost tender, as he said, "I am not asking you to love me, only to allow me the opportunity to prove I can be the husband I should have been from the start." They shared a meal together that morning, in a silence that was no longer hostile but companionable, almost peaceful, and though Catherine knew that one night of honesty could not undo a year of pain and anger and grief, she felt something shift in her chest, the smallest crack in the ice that had formed around her heart, and she thought that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward through this impossible situation they inhabited together. January arrived with a tentative softness that seemed to mirror the fragile truce Catherine and Alexander had established, and on the morning of the new year, Alexander appeared at breakfast with a book in his hand, setting it beside her plate with an awkwardness that spoke of how foreign such gestures were to him. and when she looked at the title, a volume of Wordsworth's poems she had mentioned admiring during their long night of conversation, she felt something warm unfold in her chest, even as she reminded herself to guard against hope too, easily kindled. Their days began to take on a new pattern, almost like the courtship they had never had, with Alexander asking her opinion on estate matters and actually listening to her responses, his questions revealing genuine curiosity about her thoughts on crop rotation and tenant welfare, and the small improvements she had made during his absence, and Catherine found herself studying him in return, asking careful questions about his experiences in Spain that went beyond the horror of captivity to the man he had been before the war, discovering that he had once loved music and had a talent for sketching that he had abandoned somewhere on the peninsula. The small gestures accumulated like snowfall, quiet and transforming, Alexander bringing her books from his library, volumes of poetry and philosophy he thought she might enjoy, Catherine ensuring that Cook prepared the foods he preferred and that his study fire was always lit before he entered in the evenings. And though they maintained a careful physical distance in their interactions, never touching beyond the accidental brush of fingers, there was an awareness between them that had not existed before, a consciousness of each other's presence that made the vast rooms of Montrose Hall feel somehow smaller and more intimate. On a grey afternoon in mid-January, Alexander suggested a walk through the winter gardens, and though the cold was bitter, they moved together along frost-covered paths, their breath forming clouds in the air, and their conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before, as Alexander spoke of his mother's love for these gardens, and Catherine shared memories of her own mother's passion for roses, and in the sharing of these tender remembrances, they discovered that they had both lost their parents too young. Both understood the weight of duty that came with inherited titles and expectations. Both harbored souls more inclined to poetry than practicality, despite the roles they had been forced to play. Alexander's rare smiles began to appear with greater frequency, transforming his scarred face into something almost beautiful, and Catherine felt the careful walls she had built around her heart beginning to develop cracks, small fissures through which dangerous feelings might seep if she was not vigilant, yet she found she lacked the will to repair those defenses as thoroughly as she knew she should. The household staff, ever attuned to the emotional climate of their employers, began to move with lighter steps and exchange hopeful glances. Mrs. Hallowell's stern countenance softening into something approaching approval, Mr. Pemberton smiling openly when he observed the Duke and Duchess sharing tea in companionable conversation, and even the scullery maids whispered that perhaps Montrose Hall might finally become the warm home it had always deserved to be. Edmund's name hung between them like morning mist, present but unspoken, acknowledged in the careful way they avoided certain topics and the tender consideration they showed each other's wounds, and Catherine understood that Alexander knew she still carried grief for what she had lost, even as she began to discover what she might gain, just as she recognized that Alexander bore his own complex feelings about his brother's role in her life, and this mutual understanding created a foundation of honesty upon which they were slowly, carefully, beginning to build something that felt almost like the possibility of genuine connection. February arrived with the kind of cold that seemed to seep into one's very bones, and Catherine stood at the morning-room window, watching frost patterns trace delicate ferns across the glass, when Mr. Pemberton entered with the post, his expression carefully neutral as he presented her with a single letter bearing a continental postmark, and her hands trembled as she recognized Edmund's handwriting, elegant and familiar, the sight of it causing her heart to constrict with a pain she had thought was beginning to fade under the careful tenderness of her growing connection with Alexander. She dismissed the butler with a murmur of thanks, and broke the seal with fingers that felt numb from more than just the cold, and as she read Edmund's words written from Paris where he had fled to escape the unbearable proximity of what he had lost, tears began to stream down her face unbidden, for his letter was both a release and a farewell, absolving her of guilt, while confessing that he could not remain in England knowing she was at Montrose Hall with Alexander, that he wished her every happiness, though it cost him his own, that she must not grieve for him but instead embrace whatever future awaited her with his brother, and the generosity of his words only made the ache worse, because she had genuinely loved him, and some part of her always would, even as she found herself drawn inexorably toward Alexander in ways she was only beginning to understand. Alexander found her thus, weeping silently with the letter clutched in her hand. And without asking permission, he took it from her and read, his jaw tightening as he absorbed his brother's words. And when he looked at her again, his expression held such complexity, pain and understanding, and something that might have been jealousy, warring with compassion, that she felt exposed in a way she had not been even during their long night of confessions in December. The confrontation she had been dreading and avoiding unfolded there in the winter morning light, as Alexander said quietly, "I was jealous of my brother, Catherine, not for the betrayal as I claimed, but because he gave you what I should have given you from the very beginning, his presence, his attention, his heart freely offered when I was too much a coward to offer my own." And the raw honesty in his voice broke something loose in her chest, so that she found herself responding with equal truth, saying, "He gave me what you couldn't give me then, what you were not capable of giving after years of war, had hardened you into someone who knew only duty and survival. But Alexander, I am terrified, and terrified to open my heart again, when the last time I did so, it was shattered so completely." They stood facing each other across the morning room, the letter that represented the ghost of their shared past lying between them on the small table where Alexander had placed it. And he spoke then of his own loneliness during the war years, his belief that he had become incapable of the softness that love required, his conviction that he would die in Spain, and thus his determination not to leave anyone behind who would grieve him. And Catherine heard in his confession an echo of her own fears about vulnerability and loss, and the terrible risk of allowing oneself to hope. The moment stretched between them like a bridge half-built, and Catherine understood that they stood at a crossroads where they must choose either to retreat into the safe formality that had characterized the early months of Alexander's return, or to risk genuine vulnerability with all its attendant dangers. And she saw in Alexander's eyes that he understood this too, that he was offering himself without defenses or pretense, asking her to do the same. And though terror gripped her heart, she found herself taking a step toward him instead of away, choosing courage over safety, possibility over protection, and in that single step, she felt the first true stirring of something that might, given time and patience and daily choice, transform into the love she had once believed impossible between them. Alexander moved first, closing the distance between them with steps that seemed to cost him something precious, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion as he said, "Catherine, I must apologize to you, not for Edmund or for what transpired in my absence, but for the fundamental wrong I committed on our wedding day, when I bound you to me with vows and then abandoned you within hours, leaving you alone in a strange house with a title but no true husband. And I see now that everything that followed your loneliness, your connection with my brother, the pain we have all suffered, began with my cowardice and my inability to see you as anything more than a duty to be discharged, before I returned to the war that felt safer to me than the vulnerability of marriage." Catherine felt something shift in her chest at these words, for she had expected many things from Alexander, but never this complete acknowledgement of his responsibility, never this unflinching honesty about the source of their shared suffering, and she found herself responding with equal vulnerability, saying, "And I must apologize to you, Alexander, for I allowed my heart to stray toward your brother when I was still bound to you by law and sacred vow, and though you had abandoned me in body, you were still my husband, and I betrayed that bond even if you had failed to honor it first. And I am sorry for the pain that must have caused you when you returned to find your wife in love with your brother." They stood facing each other in the winter light that streamed through the morning room windows, and Alexander reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention so she could refuse if she wished. And when she did not pull away, he took her hands in his calloused soldier's hands, engulfing her smaller ones, and he said with quiet intensity, "Our marriage began in duty, Catherine. I will not pretend otherwise, but I would ask you now if we might choose to transform it into something more, if we might give ourselves permission to begin again, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two people who have survived great pain and emerged willing to risk connection despite everything that stands against us." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the history they carried, and Catherine felt tears gathering in her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, and Alexander continued, "Then I would like your permission to court you properly, to court my own wife, as I should have done from the beginning, to show you through actions rather than words that I am capable of being the husband you deserve, if you will give me that chance." Catherine's tears spilled over then, but they were not tears of grief but rather of tentative hope, and she whispered, "Yes, Alexander, yes, I will give you that chance. Give us that chance, though I am still frightened of what it might cost me if I open my heart again." And he squeezed her hands gently and said, "I am frightened too, Catherine, terrified, in fact, for I have survived battlefields and captivity, but I have never risked my heart before, yet I find I want to risk it with you if you are willing." The days that followed took on a quality almost dreamlike in their tender transformation, for Alexander began to court her with a thoughtfulness that revealed he had been observing her far more carefully than she had realized during their months of careful proximity. And he appeared at breakfast one morning with hothouse roses from the conservatory, their petals the deep red of heart's blood, and presented them to her with a bow that would have seemed ridiculous if not for the genuine vulnerability in his eyes. They began taking meals together in the smaller dining room rather than the formal hall, and their conversations ranged across topics both profound and trivial as they discovered each other's minds and hearts. And Catherine found herself laughing at Alexander's dry wit, something she had not known he possessed, while Alexander seemed mesmerized by her observations about literature and nature and the small beauties she had learned to notice during her lonely months. In the evenings he began reading poetry to her, his deep voice transforming Wordsworth and Coleridge into something intimate and precious, and they sat closer on the settee with each passing night until their shoulders touched and neither pulled away. Catherine allowed herself to see him differently now, not as the cold duke who had abandoned her, or even as the wounded soldier who had returned to shatter her hopes, but as a man who had been as lost as she, who had built walls around his heart to survive horrors she could barely imagine, who was now dismantling those walls brick by brick in the hope of building something better with her. And in seeing him thus, she felt her own walls crumbling, felt dangerous warmth spreading through places in her heart she had thought frozen beyond redemption. And though fear still whispered warnings about the risks of loving again, she found herself choosing hope over safety, choosing the possibility of genuine connection over the protection of emotional distance, choosing Alexander with clear eyes and an open heart, despite everything that had come before. March arrived with the kind of warmth that felt like a promise after the long winter, and Catherine stood in the conservatory one morning, surrounded by early blooms when Alexander found her and asked if she might spare him a moment that evening, saying he had something he wished to share with her, and though his expression was guarded, she saw vulnerability in his eyes that made her agree immediately, curious about what had prompted this formal request when they had grown so much easier with each other in recent weeks. That afternoon she discovered him in his study, poring over leather-bound volumes that she recognized as journals, their pages filled with close handwriting, and when he noticed her presence, he looked up with an expression that held both determination and apprehension, saying, "These are my wartime journals, Catherine. Every thought and fear I committed to paper during those years when I believed I would die far from home, and I would like to share them with you tonight, if you are willing, for I think you deserve to know the man I was then, and how he became the man who stands before you now." She felt something catch in her throat at this offering, understanding instinctively that these journals represented the most private parts of himself, the scared young officer beneath the stern duke's exterior, and she told him gently that she too had kept writings during her lonely months at Montrose Hall, poems and observations she had never shown anyone, and perhaps they might share these pieces of themselves together. Evening found them in the small sitting room that had become their private sanctuary, a fire crackling in the hearth against March's lingering chill, and Alexander began reading from his earliest entries, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly as he revealed the terrified 23-year-old who had purchased his commission, believing he understood what war meant, only to discover horrors that stripped away every comfortable illusion he had carried into battle. And Catherine listened with tears gathering in her eyes as she heard him describe not glory but mud and blood and the faces of dying men, the way each death had hardened him a little more until he barely recognized himself in the shaving mirror. When he paused, she retrieved her own journal from where she had hidden it in her writing desk, and she read to him her poems about loneliness and abandonment, her observations about the empty halls and the ghost of a husband she had never known. And as she read, she watched his face crumple with pain at understanding what his abandonment had truly cost her, Not just practical loneliness, but a deeper soul ache that had nearly broken her before Edmund's arrival. And when she finished reading, Alexander reached for her hand and said hoarsely, "We are more alike than I ever imagined, Catherine. Both of us hiding tender hearts behind walls we built to survive our separate pains. Both of us convinced we were incapable of the vulnerability that love requires." They sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped, and then Alexander told her he had arranged something special for the following evening, asking only that she trust him, and when she agreed, he pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart race. The next evening he led her to the conservatory after dinner, and she gasped upon entering to find it transformed into something magical, and hundreds of candles casting flickering light across spring flowers. He had arranged himself with the gardener's help, hothouse roses and early tulips, and delicate narcissus, creating an explosion of color and fragrance, and in the center of it all he had set a small table laid for two with fine china and crystal. And as she turned to him with wonder in her eyes, he took both her hands and said with quiet intensity, "I cannot undo the past. Catherine cannot reclaim the year and more that I wasted through my own cowardice and blindness, but I would like to build a future with you, if you will have me, not as a duty or obligation, but as a choice we make freely, as two people who have survived great pain and emerged willing to risk everything for the possibility of genuine love." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who had been a stranger, then an abandoner, then a returned ghost, and who had somehow transformed into someone she was beginning to love with a depth that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, and she whispered, "We already have vows binding us. Alexander, vows spoken in a cold church nearly 2 years ago when neither of us understood what we were promising. But I would like to honor those vows now with genuine feeling, to choose you, and choose us, and choose the possibility of building something real from the ruins of what might have been." He pulled her close then, one hand cradling her face with infinite gentleness, and asked, "May I kiss you, Catherine?" Not as a husband claiming his rights, but as a man who has fallen in love with his wife and wishes to show her the depth of his feeling. And she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, and when his lips met hers, it was nothing like the perfunctory brush of mouths at their wedding ceremony, but instead a tender, hesitant exploration that spoke of new beginnings and promises chosen rather than imposed, and she felt herself opening to him like the spring flowers surrounding them, felt hope blooming in places she had thought frozen beyond redemption, felt the future stretching before them, not as a burden to be endured, but as a gift to be cherished. And when they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a second chance, Catherine, for seeing past what I was to what I might become." And she responded, "Thank you for having the courage to try, for being willing to dismantle your walls brick by brick, for choosing vulnerability over safety." And in that moment, surrounded by candlelight and flowers and the promise of spring, they both understood that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there would be no retreat, that they had chosen each other with clear eyes and open hearts, and that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together as true partners in a marriage that had been reborn from ashes into something infinitely precious. April arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that made the previous winter's hardships feel like distant memories, and Catherine woke each morning to find Alexander already awake beside her, watching her with an expression of wonder that never failed to make her heart skip, for they had begun truly living as husband and wife in every sense, in their days taking on a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous after so many months of painful distance and careful proximity. They spent mornings together in the estate office, planning improvements to the tenant cottages and discussing which fields should be rotated for summer planting, and Catherine discovered that Alexander valued her opinions not merely out of courtesy, but genuine respect for her competent management during his absence, and she found herself leaning into his shoulder as they reviewed ledgers, his arm coming around her waist as though such casual intimacy was the most natural thing in the world. The afternoons found them riding across Montrose lands together, Alexander on his great black stallion, and Catherine on the gentle mare he had chosen specifically for her comfort, and they explored every corner of the estate as though seeing it anew through each other's eyes, pausing at the old stone bridge where Alexander told her about climbing these very stones as a boy, or stopping at the tenant farms where Catherine introduced him properly to families she had come to know during his absence, and the tenants remarked with poorly concealed delight at how the stern Duke softened when he looked at his Duchess. In the evenings they established their own private rituals, sometimes reading in the library with Catherine curled against Alexander's side, as his deep voice brought poetry and novels to life, other times playing chess before the fire, with playful banter and gentle teasing that would have been unimaginable mere months ago. And Alexander's rare laughter became less rare with each passing day, his smiles coming more easily as the haunted look gradually faded from his eyes. Catherine bloomed under this genuine affection, like a flower that had been waiting for proper sunlight, her natural warmth and joy emerging from beneath the protective shell she had built during her lonely months, and the household staff remarked to one another how her laughter now rang through the halls, and how she moved through Montrose Hall with the confidence of a woman who finally knew herself beloved. Physical intimacy developed gradually between them, each touch chosen and cherished rather than claimed or obligated, and when Alexander finally carried her to his chambers one night in late April, both of them trembling with anticipation and tenderness, their union was everything their perfunctory wedding ceremony had not been, tender and emotional and transformative in ways that left them both weeping and laughing in each other's arms afterward. The morning after, Catherine woke to find herself wrapped in Alexander's embrace, his face peaceful in sleep in a way she had never seen before, and when his eyes opened and found hers, he whispered with raw emotion, "I feel as though I have come home after a very long war, Catherine, as though every battle and every suffering was merely the journey that led me to this moment with you." And she felt tears gather in her eyes as she responded, "Perhaps we both have, Alexander, perhaps we both have been fighting our own wars and have finally found our way to peace." And he kissed her then, with a reverence that spoke of promises renewed and freely chosen. The household could not help but notice the transformation, for the Duke and Duchess moved through their days with an obvious affection that manifested in 1,000 small gestures. The way Alexander's hand sought Catherine's during meals, the way Catherine's face lit up when he entered a room, the tender glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching, and even stern Mrs. Hallowell was seen smiling as she observed them together in the garden. And Mr. Pemberton remarked to the other staff that Montrose Hall had finally become the home it was always meant to be, filled not merely with duty and obligation, but with genuine love and joy. May arrived with the kind of gentle sunshine that made everything feel possible. And Catherine was arranging roses in the morning room when Mr. Pemberton appeared with a silver tray bearing a letter, his expression carefully neutral as he informed her that Lord Edmund Montrose had returned to England and had written requesting permission to call upon them at their convenience. And she felt her hand still upon the flowers as her heart began to race with a complicated mixture of emotions she had thought long settled. She found Alexander in the library reviewing estate correspondence, and when she handed him the letter without speaking, he read it carefully before looking up at her with an expression of quiet determination, saying, "We will face this together, Catherine, as we face everything now." And she felt such gratitude for his steadiness that she had to blink back tears as she nodded her agreement, knowing that this meeting was necessary if they were truly to leave the past behind them. They sent word that Edmund was welcome to call the following afternoon, and Catherine found herself unable to settle to any task as the appointed hour approached, her mind returning again and again to the man who had filled her loneliest months with warmth and companionship, the man she had loved and lost and grieved, the man whose memory had become a ghost haunting the edges of her transformed marriage. Alexander seemed to sense her agitation and kept close to her throughout the day, his presence a quiet anchor, and when Edmund's carriage finally appeared on the drive, Catherine reached for her husband's hand without thinking, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his grip. Edmund stepped into the drawing room, looking older than Catherine remembered, his boyish charm tempered by something that looked like hard-won maturity, and for a long moment the three of them stood in terrible silence, the weight of everything that had passed between them heavy in the air, until Edmund broke the stillness by bowing formally to Catherine and extending his hand to Alexander with visible emotion. The brothers clasped hands, and then, as though some dam had broken, pulled each other into an embrace that spoke of years of separation and pain, and the deep bond that had survived even betrayal, and Catherine watched through tears as Alexander said hoarsely, "I am sorry, brother, for the impossible situation my abandonment created," and Edmund responded with equal emotion, "And I am sorry for allowing my feelings to override my duty to you and to honor." And in that moment Catherine understood that whatever else this meeting brought, it would not destroy the fragile happiness she and Alexander had built. They sat together over tea, the conversation stilted at first, but gradually easing into something almost natural, and Edmund spoke of his time on the continent with a wistfulness that suggested he had been running from pain rather than seeking adventure, and when Catherine asked gently if he had found what he sought abroad, he smiled sadly and admitted that he had mostly found distance and the slow healing that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. Alexander surprised them both by reaching across to grip his brother's shoulder and saying with complete sincerity, "I owe you a debt, Edmund, for caring for Catherine when I had abandoned her to loneliness, for showing her the kindness and attention I should have provided, for being the man I was too broken to be." And Edmund's eyes filled with tears as he responded, "You owe me nothing, Alexander, for what I felt was real and selfish in equal measure, and I see now that what you and Catherine have found together is something I could never have given her. A love built on shared suffering and hard-won understanding, rather than the easy comfort of avoiding pain." Catherine found herself speaking then, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her, telling Edmund with complete honesty that she would always be grateful for the warmth he brought to her darkest months, that his kindness had kept her from drowning in loneliness, that she had loved him truly if briefly, but that she now understood that what she shared with Alexander was built on foundations that could weather any storm because they had already survived the worst that life could offer. Edmund listened with visible emotion and then said something that released them all from the lingering ghost of what might have been, admitting that he could see the love between Catherine and Alexander in every glance they shared, every unconscious touch, every moment of natural intimacy, and that while what he had felt for Catherine was real, he recognized now that they belonged together in a way that transcended his own feelings, that some loves are meant to heal us and move us forward rather than to last forever. They parted that evening with embraces and tears, and the sense of a chapter finally, truly closed, Edmund promising to visit again when his travels brought him back to England, and as Catherine and Alexander stood in the doorway watching his carriage disappear into the spring twilight, she felt Alexander's arm come around her waist and heard him whisper, "Thank you for loving me enough to face that, for being brave enough to lay the past to rest," and she turned into his embrace, knowing that they had passed through the final test of their transformed marriage and emerged stronger for it. The ghost of Edmund's love finally laid to rest with grace and mutual respect, leaving them free to move forward into their future, unburdened by the shadows of what had been. Summer arrived in 1815 with the kind of golden warmth that seemed to bless everything it touched, and as June approached, Catherine and Alexander found themselves planning their first major gathering at Montrose Hall, a celebration that would serve as both a belated wedding reception and an announcement to society that the Duke and Duchess of Montrose had truly found their way to each other after so tortuous a journey, and the contrast between this joyful preparation and the cold, hurried ceremony of 2 years prior was so striking that Catherine sometimes had to pause in her arrangements simply to marvel at how completely her life had transformed. The estate bloomed under their combined attention, roses climbing the stone walls in profusion, and the great hall decorated with garlands of summer flowers, and Catherine moved through the preparations with a radiant confidence that came from knowing herself genuinely beloved, her natural grace and warmth no longer hidden behind protective walls, but shining forth for all to see, as she consulted with Mrs. Hallowell about the menu and directed the footman in arranging the ballroom with an authority that was gentle but unquestionable. Alexander watched her preparations with undisguised admiration. This man who had once been so stern and distant, now relaxed and smiling as he observed his wife transform Montrose Hall into a place of celebration, and the household staff remarked to one another that they had never seen the Duke so at peace, his haunted soldier's eyes now bright with contentment whenever Catherine entered a room, his hand seeking hers with unconscious tenderness at every opportunity. The evening of the celebration arrived with perfect weather, the summer sun casting long golden rays across the manicured lawns as carriages began arriving from neighboring estates and from London, society coming to witness what they had heard whispered in drawing rooms across England, that the cold Duke of Montrose had somehow transformed into a devoted husband, and his abandoned bride had become a confident and beloved duchess. Catherine greeted their guests in a gown of pale blue silk that made her eyes luminous, Alexander at her side in formal evening dress, and every person who passed through the receiving line could not help but notice the way the Duke's gaze followed his wife with protective devotion, the way Catherine's face lit up whenever she looked at her husband, the subtle touches and shared glances that spoke of an intimacy earned through suffering and built on foundations of genuine understanding. The dancing began as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and when Alexander led Catherine onto the floor for the first waltz, the room fell silent to watch them move together with such natural grace and obvious affection that more than one matron dabbed at her eyes, remembering the gossip that had swirled 2 years ago about the hasty wedding and immediate abandonment, and marveling at how love had somehow bloomed in such unlikely soil. As midnight approached and the celebrations continued in full swing, Alexander drew Catherine away from the crowds into the garden, where lanterns hung like stars among the roses, and there in the soft darkness he pulled her close and whispered that he had an announcement he wished to make to their guests, and Catherine's heart began to race as she realized what he intended, for they had shared their joyful secret only between themselves until this moment, savoring the knowledge in private before declaring it to the world. They returned to the ballroom hand in hand, and when Alexander called for silence and raised his glass to toast his duchess, his voice was thick with emotion as he declared before all assembled that Catherine had given him the greatest gift imaginable, that she had transformed his house into a home and his duty into devotion, and that come winter she would make him the happiest of men by presenting him with an heir, and the room erupted in congratulations and joy as Catherine blushed and accepted embraces from ladies who had once pitied her as an abandoned bride. Later, as the guests departed and the servants began clearing away the remnants of celebration, Alexander and Catherine walked together through the quiet gardens, and his arm around her waist and her head resting against his shoulder, and in the soft darkness he said with wonder in his voice, "If I could relive that day in 1813, Catherine, I would never have left you, never have been so foolish as to abandon what I had been given." And she turned to face him with tears shining in her eyes as she responded, "If you had not left, my love, if we had not walked through darkness and pain and the terrible wilderness of misunderstanding, we might never have found our way to this place, to this love that we choose daily rather than accept as obligation, and perhaps that makes it more precious than if it had come easily." And he kissed her then with such tenderness that she felt the truth of their journey settle into her bones, the wisdom that some loves must be forged in fire to become unbreakable, that patience and choice and the courage to begin again can create something more beautiful than any fairy tale romance. And as they stood together in the garden of Montrose Hall, with the future stretching bright before them, both understood that they had finally, truly come home. 5 years had passed since that golden summer celebration of 1815, and on a crisp autumn morning in 1820, Montrose Hall rang with the kind of laughter that would have been unimaginable in the cold, silent days when Catherine first arrived as an abandoned bride. For now 3 children filled the ancient corridors with their joyful chaos. Young James at 5 years old, already showing his father's serious nature, tempered by his mother's warmth. Little Charlotte at 3, possessing her mother's grace and her father's determined spirit, and baby William just beginning to toddle after his siblings, with squeals of delight that made even the stern Mrs. Hallowell smile indulgently. Catherine stood at the nursery window watching Alexander in the gardens below, his dark hair now touched with distinguished silver at the temples, his posture relaxed as he knelt in the grass to examine something James had discovered among the roses, and she felt such profound contentment wash over her that she had to pause simply to breathe it in, this happiness so complete and earned that it sometimes still took her breath away with its unexpected sweetness. The years had been generous to them both, seasoning their hard-won love with the kind of depth that only comes from choosing each other daily, from weathering small storms together and celebrating quiet victories, from building a life brick by brick on foundations of genuine understanding and mutual devotion rather than obligation and duty. Alexander had transformed from the haunted soldier who returned from war into a devoted husband and father who read bedtime stories with voices for all the characters, who carried tired children on his shoulders through the estate, who still sought Catherine's hand across the dinner table after all these years, and who whispered his gratitude for her patience every night before sleep, as though the wonder of their love had never become commonplace to him. Catherine herself had bloomed into the role she was always meant to inhabit, no longer the uncertain girl abandoned on her wedding day, but a confident duchess, beloved by her household and her tenants, a mother whose children ran to her for comfort and wisdom, a wife who had learned that the greatest strength sometimes lay in choosing vulnerability over protection, in risking one's heart even after it had been broken, in believing that transformation was always possible if both parties were willing to do the difficult work of becoming. That evening, after the children had been tucked into their beds with kisses and promises of stories tomorrow, Catherine and Alexander sat together in their private sitting room, she with her embroidery and he with his book, comfortable in the companionable silence that had become their favorite form of intimacy. And when he looked up to find her watching him with soft eyes, he set aside his reading to reach for her hand, bringing it to his lips with the tenderness that had never diminished despite their years together, murmuring as he did every night, "Thank you, my love, for your patience with a fool who nearly lost the greatest gift he had ever been given." And she responded, as she always did, with tears shining in her eyes, "You were worth waiting for, Alexander, worth every moment of darkness, for what we have built together could only have been forged in the fire we endured." And they sat together in the firelight of Montrose Hall, their children sleeping peacefully above them, their love a testament to the power of second chances and the grace of beginning again. Dear listener, perhaps you have known your own version of this journey, the false start that felt like failure, the wrong path that seemed to lead only to pain, the love that appeared impossible until patience and choice and the courage to be vulnerable transformed it into something more beautiful than you had imagined possible. Catherine and Alexander's story teaches us that the greatest love stories are rarely the ones that begin perfectly in a blaze of passion and certainty, but rather those that endure imperfectly through seasons of doubt and darkness, emerging stronger for having survived the trials that would have destroyed lesser bonds. Remember that transformation is always possible if both hearts are willing to do the difficult work of changing, that patience can heal even the deepest wounds if given time and tenderness, that choosing love daily with intention and grace is infinitely more powerful than falling into it once in a moment of heady emotion. In your own life, when faced with broken beginnings and shattered expectations, when standing in the ruins of what you thought your story would be, remember that there is always time to begin again, always possibility for redemption and renewal if you have the courage to remain open to it. May you find the strength to be vulnerable even when your heart has been wounded, the patience to allow transformation to unfold in its own time rather than forcing growth that cannot be rushed, and the deep peace that comes from love truly chosen rather than merely accepted as obligation. Rest well tonight, knowing that even the coldest winter eventually yields to spring, that even the most abandoned heart can find its way home, that redemption is always within reach for those brave enough to extend their hands toward it. This story comes to you from Tales of Heart and Healing, and may it serve as a gentle reminder that your own journey, however difficult, however marked by false starts and painful detours, can still lead you to the love and belonging you seek if you refuse to surrender to despair and instead choose hope, again and again, until hope becomes reality and the life you were meant to live finally unfolds before you in all its hard-won glory.